our next presenters, a team of people from Spanish company Azteca. And I noticed they attended a lot of previous decision camps, and I hope decision camp influenced their own decision to productize what they have and come up with new product. And Alexandra yesterday introduced this product, Cardinate, and probably they will mention this product today, but also they want to offer a novel way to visualize a decision requirement graph. And this sounds like very interesting suggestion. Dario?
Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm Dario Campagna, Senior Researcher and Agile Coach at Azteca, and I'm working with Alessandro Turco, Carlos Cauca, and Sara Nicastro on the development of our BPMN and DMN editor called Cardinate. So the subject of this talk is the visualization of DMN models, in particular the decision requirement graphs, using a system modeling tool called Design Structure Matrices. And in this talk, I will first frame the problem that we looked at in the past month, and it's the management of complex decision models, in particular in the context of DMN. And there's a question that we focused on and that we had in mind since the beginning of our work with DMN. And the question is, how can we visualize the whole DRG? And one question, in our opinion, comes from the systems engineering and engineering management world, and it's in the form of the so-called design structure matrices. I will give you a short introduction about this tool, and then I will show you how we can translate DRG into one or more DSM to visualize the complete DRG in a compact and concise form. Finally, we'll wrap up this talk and spend a few words on the current and future activities that we are doing and we plan around DMN and DSM. So before I start by framing the problem, and more precisely to start framing the problem, I invite you, the people on Slack to answer to a quick poll and to answer to the following question. So given a decision model with many subdecisions and interrelationships between them, how would you represent it graphically? And we have 5 options. So a single diagram like a DRD in DMN, a separate but overlapping diagrams like multiple DRDs, orchestrated decision microservices with the state machine, tabular representation, or other representations. So I have the poll posted in the Slack channel for today. We have some answer coming up. So separate but overlapping diagrams is winning now. I will give you a couple of seconds, more 10 to 20 seconds to collect the answer. Okay, so separate but overlapping diagrams is still the top answer among the 5, and that's good because in the DMN specification in section 6.2.4 we find this sentence: for any significant domain of decision making, a DRD representing the complete DRG may be a large and complex diagram. So we have this clue from the specification that using a single DRD may not be a good idea. And in the specification, we also have other ideas about the management of complex models. And if we look at the origination example that was mentioned also in other presentation, in this example, we have this quite intricate DRD presented as the first of the 5 DRD, and it is the DRD of all automated decision making. And just below this diagram, we have this sentence: it might be considered more convenient to draw separate but overlapping decision requirement diagrams. And the example goes on showing 4 other DRDs, 3 for the main decision point, strategy, adjudication, and routing, and 1 additional DRD for the credit risk analytics knowledge source. So what the specification suggests is to model draw your decision model using more than one DRD with maybe overlapping elements, so elements appearing in more than one DRD. And this is a good practice, and we liked it. And the first time we read about it, we immediately thought of this question: how can we visualize the complete DRG when we have all these DRD that are overlapping and that represent our model? And why we think this question is important, because you may still want to have an overview of your model, of your DRG. You may still want a quick way to understand for an element what are all the requirements it is involved in. Or you may want to have a way to easily answer a question like, what if we change this element? What if we split this decision in sub-decision? What are the consequences on our decision model? And this question, we can come up with different answers for this question. For example, we may use a list to describe all the elements and requirements, or use a tree to show all the elements and requirements. But these two solutions have some flaw. For example, in the list, the information is scattered, and both the tree and the list may be long. In the tree, you may have a problem of duplication in information, in particular when you have an element that is involved in more than one requirement, then you need to decide where to put its details and so on. And there may be also other possible answers. And one answer that we think is interesting is to use Design Structure Matrix. So to see what we can do with DSM, we need first to, I need first to introduce it and to let you know what a DSM is. So let's start with a simple definition of the basic definition for Design Structure Matrix. A design structure matrix is a square matrix that shows relationships among elements of a system. What system? Basically any engineering system. We have an example here of a system that is a set of 6 tasks with input-output relationships modeled with these arrows. So we have task 1 that produce some information for task 2, task 3 that produce information for task 1 while receiving information from task 2, and so on. So we have a process model in terms of tasks that we need to execute and information flows between these tasks. A DSM for such a model as is a 6x6 matrix. We have on the diagonal these shaded squares that represent the elements. So each element as associated a row and a column. And then we have off-diagonal marks that represent relationships. In DSM, we have 2 conventions for modeling a system. One is the input row convention, that is the one we are using. And in the input row convention, given an element, for example, task 1, when you read its row, then you see what are the inputs to that element. So where you see the elements that produce something and for the element. For example, for task 1, we see that we have an X on the column of task 3. So this means that task 1 receives something from task 3. If you read a column, instead you see what the elements provide, so the outputs of an element. And we see that for task 1, we have a mark for task 2 and for task 5, and that are the output relations between task 1 and the other 2 tasks. So this is the basic definition of DSM, so a matrix representing elements and relationships. And this particular example is an example of a binary DSM, because we are simply representing the existence or absence of relationships between elements. So this is what a DSM is, and you may wonder, why does this tool exist? And DSM is a tool that has been developed and used in different fields in the past 30 years. At MIT, they started looking at it in the 90s, and is now considered a technique that helps people to better design, develop, and manage complex engineered systems. So it's primarily being used in the area of engineering management, and it's now a generic tool for modeling any type of system architecture. And it has two main advantages when as a tool for the representing system architecture. One is the representation that is simple, concise, and it helps in highlighting key patterns, and it also scales better than other representation formats. The second advantage is innovation. DSM facilitates situation visibility, and it stimulates analysis of any innovation in system architectures. What you see here on the right is a more elaborate example than the one in the previous slide of a DSM. And this example comes from a tool called JArchitect. It's a tool for the static analysis of Java code. And in this tool, DSM are used to show the dependencies between components in a software project, where components can be methods, packages, classes. And here they use colors to show different types of relationships and also different shades of the same color. And what's interesting about this picture that comes from the documentation of JArchitect is that on the right, we have the same information modeled with the DSM represented in terms of a graph. And this image gives you an idea of what is intended with advantages in terms of representation. And for sure, we can say that in this context, a DSM scales better than a graph to represent dependencies. In the past 30 years, DSM have been used in a lot of different fields. And in the book, Design Structure Matrices, Methods and Applications, you can find more than 40 examples of use. And this comes from fields like aerospace, automotive, electronics, and many more. And in these different fields, DSM have been used to model product architecture, organization architecture, process architecture, of a mix of domains. We as a stakeholder got interested in this tool because aerospace and automotive are also fields where Esteco technology is used, and the main Esteco technologies are about engineering, simulation, and optimization. So we wanted to know more about DSM to find out what are the synergy or interactions or connections with engineering, simulation, optimization, but also business process modeling and decision modeling. And we started looking at DSM a couple of years ago, and last year we got more involved also in the DSM community. And some months ago we thought, what about using DSM for modeling, for visualizing, DMN models or the DRG? And it turns out that it's quite straightforward to create a design structure matrix from a DRG and from the elements and requirements of a DRG. So let me show you how these things work with this very simple example. So here we have two decisions, two inputs, one business knowledge model, one knowledge source. So from a DSM point of view, this is our system, and the elements are the decisions, inputs, business knowledge module, and knowledge source. So we can represent these elements in a DSM, in a 6x6 DSM, and the cells on the diagonals are our elements. We have use the same level to better understand what elements corresponds to what rows and columns, and we are also using 4 different colors to represent the type of element. So if the elements of our system are decisions and so on, the interactions are the requirements in the DRG. We have 3 types of requirements: authority requirements, knowledge requirements, and information requirements. And we can represent them as off-diagonal marks using three different markers. So we have decided we gone for the triangle facing down for the information requirement, the dot for the authority requirement, and the V for the knowledge requirement, just to use the same connectors that we have in the DMN model. And so, for example, for decision 2, if we look at its decision D2, if we look at its row, we see that it requires input 1 and input 2. No, sorry. That yes, input 1 and input 2, and the business knowledge model. If we look at the row for input 1, we see that it simply provides something to decision D2. So, as you see, the translation is quite straightforward. And to see it applied on a quite intricate model, we decided to apply it to the origination example in the specification. And this is the DSM that we obtain applying this translation to the DRG of origination. So we have 31 rows and columns because in the examples we have 31 elements. And again, we have the different colors to highlight the different types and the 3 types of markers to represent the requirement. As you may notice, with respect to the first of the 5 DRDs in the specification for the example, this representation is more concise and simple. We don't have an intricate diagram with overlapping edges. And we can easily answer questions like, what are the requirements that involve applicant data? We take applicant data columns and look at it, and we see all the requirements that it is involved in. What about the things that a decision requires? We can take the row of that decision, for example, routing, and we see immediately what are the elements that this decision requires. Elements and requirements are not the only thing that we can show in a DSM. We can also show decision services and the DRD that are present in the model. And to do that, we can use a convention that is called external input output. So in DSM, you can use these external columns, for example, to represent some entities or other systems that interact with the system that you are modeling with the DSM. So in this case, we have 2 external columns for the 2 decision services defined in Originations, and we have 4 columns for the 4 separate and overlapping DRDs. So we are assuming that we don't have the first big DRD in this case. And what do we put in these columns? We put different markers to show what element appear in a decision service or in a DRD. For the decision service, we use the eye for input data and the triangle facing to the left for internal decision and the square for the exposed decision. And for DRD, we simply put a mark in the cells corresponding to a DRD and to the row of an element for elements that appear in a certain DRD. So in this DSM, we have all the information that are in the DRG concerning the requirements level of the model. And this can give you a complete overview of the elements in our model, the requirements, and how the DRD are structured. But we can do also a little bit more. And so that's one more thing that we can do. One of the analyses that is performed usually in DSM is called sequencing, and it's basically a reordering of rows and columns to highlight or different patterns or information about the DSM. So if we reorder this DSM, we can get to different visualization of the same information. And an example of reordering is the following one. So this is the most elaborate DSM that I'm going to show. In this case, we use the DRDs to reorder the rows and columns of the DSM. And we do it in the following way. First, we put all the elements, so from request product to strategy, that appear in the first of the 4 DRD in the origination example. And we also highlight this subset of elements with this yellow square. Then we look at the second DRD, and we put in the DSM the 5 elements that appear in the second DRD and not in the first DRD. We do the same for the third DRD, and we have these three elements that appear in the third DRD, but not in the first and the second. And then we have this last element that appears only in the fourth DRD in the origination example. So we have simply reordered the rows and columns and added these colored squares to highlight these elements coming from different DRD. And we also use the same colors that we are using for a particular DRD to highlight the cells in the row of for an element that appears also in other DRDs. So for example, applicant data is an element that appears in all the four DRDs in the originations. And to show this, we highlight with the green color, blue color, and yellow all the cells that intersect with cells pertaining to the other DRDs. So this different visualization with more colors and a different ordering convey the same information of the external input-output columns, but in a different way that may be more immediate to someone. And also this different view may make it easier to understand how the elements are spread among the DRDs, how much overlaps there is between the different DRDs. And also, this visualization resembles another kind of DSM, that is the so-called multi-domain matrix, where you take different DSM and combine them together to obtain another DSM that look at different domains and their interactions. So to wrap up this talk, we look at the DMN models and the management of big DRG using a tool from system modeling, from system engineering, sorry, and the engineering management. And we show that we can use this tool to create different visualization of a DRG. And we think that it can help in creating concise and compact visualization of the whole DRG to that can help people to get more insight about the model that they are working on. We show that we can create different DSMs starting from the same information contained in the DRG. And currently we are working on different type of analysis that can be applied to DSM. One of them is the so-called clustering analysis. And what we are studying is how to use clustering on a DSM created from a DRG to generate automatically different possible DRD configurations that can again give other insights to the people that are working on the model. That was my final slide, so thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Dario. Quite a discussion going on about a couple of different things over in the Slack channel. Jan Purchase noted that there are, or asked if the dependencies in the DSM cells were unidirectional. So if you look at some of the early examples that you showed, like the one on slide 8, I think all appear to be symmetric about the diagonal, but not with the DMN examples. And then Bob Moore said that there are no dependencies in the top right, only the bottom left. So that this, but that this is not really a surprise because the DRD is a DAG, a directed acyclic graph. Yes,
that's a good observation. In fact, in the origination example, the graph is acyclic, and that's a thing that you can see from a DSM when there are no relationships above the diagonal in the case of the input row convention. And when you use DSM for processes, you try to apply sequencing algorithm to the DSM to find out whether there are feedback loops or not. And again, when you don't have relationship above the diagonal, then you don't have cycles. Then I see Jan Purchase dependencies not in the DSM cells are unidirectional. It depends. So it depends on the type of relationship that you are modeling. So in the examples that I shown, yes, they are unidirectional. Also in the big example, it's a symmetric table, yes. Then for example, in the book that I mentioned, there are examples where in the DSM and in the same cells, you represent more than one type of relations using numerical values or colors. So in that case, the dependencies may not be unidirectional, but also bidirectional. So it depends on your type of relationships.
Okay, so you can see Jacob's question there too, is that can you extract a sequencing logic from the DSM? Can you state that a DSM is executable?
In general, I would say no. DSM as the main use of DSM is to analyze a system and then reason about it and reason about what to change to the system to make it better. Then there is an extension of DSM called XDSM that is used in the context of multidisciplinary optimization to represent a multidisciplinary optimization problem. And that kind of DSM then can be translated into executable algorithms, or more precisely, executable strategy for optimization. So again, it depends on what you are modeling and what you are putting into the DSM.
Okay.
So,
Hans Post asked, how can you identify the final decision or decisions in this matrix?
Yes. Well, in this last type of DSM, we highlighted with these red cells the decisions that in different DRDs are what we call root decisions. That is, the decisions that are that have no output relations. And if you look at these other DSM, or even these, we ordered them looking at the we reorder them using a sequencing algorithm that tries to avoid having the so-called feedback loops. And it turns out that the last row, the strategy, is one of the root decision. So you can identify root decisions by looking at the output relationships from an element. When an element has no output relations, then you can consider it as a root decision.
Okay, good. Rolando is asking if you're using plain Excel or are there software tools that you use to generate or configure these matrices?
So for this example and this study, we simply used Google Sheet because and Excel works would have worked fine at the same. But there are tools to model, to create DSM, and also that to apply algorithms for analysis of the DSM. There are quite a number of them. Also some open source.
Okay, good. Matteo is asking, did you find this most useful as a printed report, like just as a visualization, or as a hyperlink so that maybe you could click on a cell and then jump to the DRD?
We started thinking about what could be possible uses, and having it as a part of our report could be one. Having an interactive tool to work on a DSM could be another way to use it, just to look at the DRG and generate different visualization in real time, and maybe yes, also having a way to come to go to this view and then back to the DRD could be a way to use it and to go from a local view on a DRD and back to a global view on the DSM to understand what's changed and so on. Yes,
so almost like drilling down on the yeah. DRD at any point. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So Jacob's asking if you have all the decision models BKMs defined, then you could generate a DSM automatically. He's or asking if you could generate a DSM automatically if you had the BKMs.
Well, if we have the the XML the model in XML format with all the elements and the requirements, yes, it can be done automatically. It's quite a straightforward algorithm that can be for sure implemented.
Okay, good. Well, definitely lots of people think this is very interesting, thinking about ways in which they can use it. So some good discussion still going on the Slack channel, but I think we're at the top of the hour. So we'll finish up with this presentation, and then you can
Sandy, it was one more question from Jan Purchase. How about scalability of this model?
Oh yes, I missed that one.
Well, that's one thing that we may want to look at. Looking at the examples of that coming from the industry and that are present in the book that I mentioned, you can. I saw that there are examples that are quite complicated in the sense that where the DSM has even hundreds of lines and rows, and that was for some people a nice tool to reason about their systems. So I believe that it scales well as long as you embrace this idea of working with this matrix representation.
Okay, good. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dario. And I think we will get ready to move on to the next presentation.